Boys have an inherent capacity and desire to develop and engage in close, mutual, responsive relationships. And what gets in the way are these socialization messages that say, oh no, that's for girls. Be a man, man up, implies that whoever they are now is somehow not enough. I think the other thing too is it also implies that there's only one right or best way to be a real boy or man. Parents are always a role model for your kid. And that doesn't mean, parents need to be perfect all the time. In fact, I would really say they don't need perfection. Your kids, what really helps them is to witness and experience that people feel all kinds of things and it's okay. Because that's a model, an example for them to know that when that happens for them, they're not the first person ever to experience that.
Dr. Judy Chu, welcome to the Meaning of Men. What is your mission in the work that you do?
Well, I think as an educator, I think my main mission is to help people get the information they need to make informed choices about how they want to be. So it's not to tell them what they should do, but just so they can have access to the resources and support. And again, just, research-backed knowledge that's available out there, but can be sometimes hard to find in this world of when you Google something, everything turns up. So just kind of directing them to at least people that I've come to trust because I know that they do rigorous, systematic, really inclusive research and trying to share that out with people. I think that's what excites me and that's what my main goal is.
Give me a sense of what's led you down the path that you're on and the work that you do.
Well, I think kind of alongside or at the same time that I was studying in academia, like learning about gender and relationships, and especially from my mentor and advisor, Carol Gilligan, who had done this groundbreaking research with adolescent girls and found out about how, gendered norms and expectations and stereotypes could impact the way girls see themselves and how they conduct themselves in social situations and what their options were for their relationships. I was starting to wonder, well, a lot of people would wonder, what about boys? And at the time that I was learning that in school, I was happened to have an encounter with my brother, who was 9 years younger, and his friends. I was driving them around during the summertime, and they wanted to know what I was learning. I shared that I was learning about this research with girls, and they said, they agreed that it was important, but but he noted that one of the boys in particular said, well, there's stuff going on for boys too, and nobody's talking to us. And so he said, you should study boys. You can start with me. And so that's really how I started to study boys, is I went back to Harvard after that summer and told Carol what this boy had said to me. And she says, clearly he has something to say. So why don't you talk to him? I interviewed him for 2 hours. He had so much to share that I had not expected an adolescent boy to be thinking about, much less wanting to tell somebody else about. But I was very pleasantly surprised and very impressed by the depth of reflection and the awareness. So that's what kind of led me to study boys. Boys themselves led me to study boys.
This is a subject that I have been pressed on a lot by people that are interested in the podcast. I think I generally know a lot of parents anyway, so that's probably one of the driving factors. But I think that from both a father and a mother perspective, there's a real desire to learn more about how to bring up healthy, happy boys. What would you like people to take away from our conversation today?
I think for parents especially, I think it's so easy, and myself included, it's so easy to worry. We have our kids' best interests at heart. We want them to be happy and healthy, and we know that the world is not always the most hospitable place, especially if they're quirky or different, which actually all kids are. I mean, each kid is sensitive and each kid has their own kind of quirks, and to be able to kind of, to the extent possible, not necessarily shield them from being, from encountering negative feedback, but to help them know what to do when that happens, if and when that happens, and how they can still continue to feel good about themselves, and to value what they have to offer, uniquely, and to not be kind of trapped by and constrained by societal expectations or assumptions about who they are based on their gender or their race or their ethnicity or their class background. None of those kind of identity features, we don't want that to get in their way. So I think, in terms of parental concerns, I think it's really challenging. And so for, first and foremost, to trust that we know our kids, that we have their best interests at heart, and that we can help them first and foremost by really listening to them and really trusting what they're telling us, because I think we can get swept up in those societal pressures as well, and it's easy for us not to turn on our kids, but to, as we're doubting ourselves, wonder if, oh, maybe we should be pushing them in one direction or the other, for fear that, we don't want them to have a, be at a disadvantage, right? And so again, trusting what we know, trusting kids, what they know and are telling us, and then kind of really, creating spaces for listening and for conversation.
So I've got a daughter and a son, and I was thinking the other day around how I feel in terms of bringing up a girl and a boy, and whether there's differences in maybe my approach and how I think about it. And it kind of struck me that I almost feel a bit more pressure with bringing up my son, because I think maybe like down the line, when obviously he's a grown man, I almost rightly or wrongly feel, because of everything that's kind of going on in society today, that there's obviously going to be such a big impact in like how I am with him as his father and how he turns out as a man. um I mean, what you were saying there is quite reassuring in terms of just trusting your judgment and knowing that you know your kids best. But there's definitely a part of me that feels that pressure over raising a son. Is that something that you've heard from other parents, other dads especially?
Definitely. I think, every parent is trying their best to provide all that they can for their kids. And I think it's, like you're saying, that the, global conversation around boys and men and masculinity has become this kind of really touchy, and it almost feels like it's very easy to kind of walk into a trap, like with the best intention. There's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, and there's a lot of labeling, and again, kind of boiling back down to kind of what really matters is being there for our kids and showing up in the ways that we want, that we know will matter most, what, and provide them with what they need. And I think that, what they need is exactly what you're striving toward, is to really understand, like, what's going on for them outside of all the noise, not letting all the, the messages that we're hearing about what boys are at risk of becoming, but really kind of, checking in with ourselves and being, raising our own awareness about what issues are these raising for myself, especially as a man, because you were once a boy and you once experienced, at a different time and in a different place, but these messages. And so a lot of it, I trust that is comes from the best place of good intentions, and you want to protect them and keep them safe. You don't want them to be ridiculed or excluded or, or bullied or, anything like that. So we want to keep them safe, but we also see things that we feel. I mean, this is what Carol Gilligan and I heard when we spoke with boys' fathers. These are 4-year-old boys, and Carol asked them this question, said, what is it like for you as adult men to be with your boys at this age? And it was just this beautifully complex, kind of almost a sense of what she called exquisite dilemma. Because on one hand, they love the boys' exuberance and their being willingness to be out there and friendly and just really like wearing their hearts on their sleeves and saying exactly what they feel and mean and being affectionate and tender, all the things, and also, having moments where they're frustrated and angry, but just experiencing it all so fully. And then they knew from their own experience, these fathers knew from their experiences as children, that can very easily get shut down, by other people's criticisms. You're too this, you're too soft, you're too sensitive, you're too angry, you're too this. And so how to kind of, balance that, like how to balance like what you're experiencing from yourself, all the things that you're feeling, and then what you're being told or observing, society's rules for how men and boys are supposed to act. And especially, around masculinity, there can be some really strict and narrow ideas, like, this like idea of, you have to be tough physically and emotionally, you have to kind of be in control of people and your emotions. And life just doesn't really work that way. Life is messy and life is unpredictable, and you need to be, flexible and adaptive. And there are going to be moments where you feel incredibly vulnerable, and to shut those things down doesn't necessarily serve us well in our personal relationships and even in our professional relationships.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the global conversation around men can add extra pressure, but I guess to an extent you have to block out the noise and just concentrate on doing the best job that you can, regardless of what else is going on.
Also, I think, and this is just as in on the side, but as a parent, I think when we read the headlines and we hear the concerns, I think absolutely I can understand those concerns, but also to remember that most boys and men aren't those. It's kind of like we're hearing what's the loudest, and
Mm.
it makes us scared. But again, it's just kind of reminding ourselves, like, we know boys and men. Look to the boys and men in our lives. We know there are a lot of really decent, kind, good, men are more complicated than the tropes that are being circulated on social media suggest. So it's not to say that there aren't real problems that are kind of out there, but it's not the tsunami of fear that it needs to be. And I think, again, I really believe in the decency of boys and men. I believe that they are trying their best to do, to be people they can be proud of, people their families and friends can want to be with and be proud of. And I think, even when they go to some of the sites that are out there that we consider maybe not optimal, because maybe not being the advice is not in their best interest per se. I think that when they go, the questions are real and the questions are normal. It's normal for them to kind of want to figure out, how can I be with other people? What will be acceptable to them? We all kind of fear ending up lonely or ending up, not having anyone know who we are and things like that. And so these are all real questions. And if we can provide, again, better resources and support and validate those questions and then give them ways to kind of figure out, know that it's going to be okay. Because this was a theme that actually has been going on ever since I started studying boys 30 years ago. So in the 90s, I would say I was studying boys. And first of all, the response would be like, oh no, adolescent boys, they're just horrible. And I'm like, they're not. And they also, those kinds of messages and attitudes trickle down. Like, even if you're not saying them to boys directly, they're hearing it because their teachers are hearing it or their parents are hearing it. And so it creates this weird kind of echo chamber for them that's
Mm.
inaccurate. That, oh gosh, people think you're horrible. The other thing, well, though, was like parents or people would say, like, oh, like this one woman came up to me and she's like, oh, well, I got the last good man. Like, my husband is the last good
Mm.
man. And again, I'm like, I'm sure your husband is fine, but there are a lot of good men out there, or mothers who would come, or usually mothers, but fathers too, would be like, oh, my son isn't like other boys. He's sweet
Mm.
and he's sensitive. And again, I don't doubt that their sons are sweet and sensitive, but it's interesting that they would kind of contrast that with this
Mm.
stereotype of boys as a group, when actually there's a lot of parents, the majority of parents are like, oh my. So to kind of counteract that pluralist, what social psychologists call pluralistic ignorance, and what I tend to describe, possibly inaccurately, as like the kind of emperors wearing no clothes. It's like,
Mm.
if we actually look, we actually all know a lot of really good, kind, sweet, sensitive boys and men.
What surprised you most during your years of research on boys, particularly in their early childhood?
I think it had a lot to do with kind of what I hinted at with the adolescent boys, but definitely with the younger boys too. Is just because I had grown up, hearing these stereotypes and making these assumptions about boys. You read a lot about, or it's just implied in a lot of the characters, even what we see in the media, like that they would be incapable of or uninterested in, close, emotionally intimate relationships. And just how wrong that stereotype is. I was so pleasantly surprised by how self-aware they were, how attuned they were to what other people were feeling, how in my book I outlined kind of, some examples, and like they were very articulate, like they could say exactly what they were thinking and feeling. And then they were also very, on that same note, very authentic. Like if they didn't like something or they didn't like you or they didn't trust you, they let you know it. And that, in a way, that's so refreshing because, then you know that when they do trust you and they do share things with you, that you can believe what they're saying, right? And then finally, they were really attentive. Again, just kind of paying attention to people's feelings, knowing their own feelings, believing that their feelings mattered, you know? And I think that kind of comes under threat as they get older because people either tell them directly or indirectly that what you're feeling doesn't matter, just get over it.
Just so I can picture that a little bit better, what age were the boys?
So these were 4-year-old boys. And so I met them when they were 4 in their pre-kindergarten classroom, and I followed them for 2 years. So through their pre-kindergarten year and their kindergarten year, and then I checked in with them again in first grade and in third grade. So
It's really interesting because from the way that you were describing it, they sounded like they were older boys, and actually they're only a year older than my son. And to me, it's amazing to think of him like in a year's time having those kind of conversations and interacting in that way. It's amazing, really. Phrases like "be a man," "man up," "don't cry," thrown around a lot. What kind of impact can those phrases have on young boys?
I think first and foremost, just the language of it is, be a man, man up implies that wherever they are, whoever they are now, is somehow not enough, right? So they have to strive to become something more or something else, in order to be valued, worthy, acceptable, lovable. So it's like whoever the imply, whether or not people mean it to imply that, the language does imply that as you are, it's not enough. So you need to go become something else. I think the other thing too is it also implies that there's only one right or best way to be a real boy or man, and that's obviously not true. There are multiple masculinities. We could argue that there's as many masculinities as there are boys and men, and so really kind of the be a man or man up really kind of sets boys and men up to focus on one particular image of masculinity when in fact they actually know, they know from observation and experience that there are many ways. So one of the tasks or one of the ways that parents and educators can counteract that is to remind them of what they know. So the way the be a man or the man up box, many people talk about it in terms of the man box or the be a man box. And that usually they'll ask you, so what do you think of when I say man up or be a man? And they'll talk about it and they'll put the words in the box. So that's the whole tough, stoic, self-sufficient, dominant over women, all these things. And so we all know that that's the kind of default one that comes to mind when we say it. But then if you ask them, well, what do you think of when I say he's a good man or he's a great man, and you get kind of a slightly different list. You get loyal, responsible, honest, respectful, trustworthy, all these things. So we know that too. Right. But it's not the first list that comes up. It's not the first thing that comes to mind. And so the first thing that comes to mind is very much, aligned with stereotypes. And so one of the things that we can do to counteract that, again, is just to remind kids of, there are exceptions to this. Is it true that all boys have short hair and all girls have long hair? Well, let's look around. Is that true? Or is it true that, only boys can do math? And, oh, wait, there's girls in your math class. Or, just a lot of things that, or only girls can play with dolls. Well, there are boys who like dolls too. Kind of just pointing out exceptions to the rule will help them to remain inclusive, to think in a more inclusive way, because it's there in their awareness, but it's just not the first thing they call to mind. And the first thing that comes to our minds is certainly not the only thing that we know.
It's interesting because up until recently, I'd always thought of those phrases being used in a belittling, negative way. But actually, I was having a conversation with someone recently, and they said a lot of the times they actually come in conversations where people feel like they're trying to help boys. If they say man up, they're saying it because they don't want them to maybe get bullied in school, for example, or don't want to be seen in a certain way. So there's almost a they're trying to help the boy out, which actually scared me a little bit because obviously I can kind of see where they were coming from to a point, but then you think obviously all the negative connotations to it as well. So it can be a real minefield, and it's not easy, obviously.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Big Hero 6, but they kind of did a different take on it. And and she says it in an encouraging way. She says, "Woman up," right?
Mm,
It's like, here's a big task, here's a big challenge, kind of gather your courage and let's go. And so it can be, in certain contexts, meant to motivate. But
mm,
again, it really depends on kind of content and intent. And whenever something happens, we always want to encourage kids to look at impact and intent, right? So if something, was intended to be empowering, but has the impact of making people feel like, oh, it's a criticism, or it's somehow saying that I'm falling short, then we need to consider how it has landed in a particular situation. But I think anything, like your great questions, saying anything that complicates our thinking is a good thing. I
mm,
think we, as humans, we tend to want too much for everything to be very clear and simple.
mm.
It's either good or it's bad. This person is either good or they're bad. And the truth is, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of complexity, and it all depends on situation. And to recognize that is something that is inconvenient, but it makes it more accurate and it allows us to respond in ways that are more appropriate.
Before we dive back into the episode, if you're enjoying these conversations, please do hit that subscribe button and leave a review. These two actions really make a huge difference and help the show reach more people who can benefit from these discussions. Let's keep building this community together. Thanks for being part of it. Back to the episode. My wife and I are both very keen that our kids are comfortable with their emotions, talking about their emotions, showing vulnerability. Um, And even though Theo's only 3, I can see that he's a sensitive kid, and I can see those traits in him. One of the things I worry about a little bit is whether he will be more at risk of potential bullying at school if his peers see that he's expressing these emotions and showing vulnerability, because obviously it's, for a lot of boys it's probably not the done thing. So, obviously wanting to raise emotionally aware children, does that almost inadvertently put them at risk of bullying when they start school?
I think it depends on the school situation. I think I mean, it can put them at risk if it's a school where kind of kids are left to kind of sink or swim. But I think that that's where educators and parents can play a really important role in ensuring that that it doesn't all fall on the kids to have to take care of themselves and to kind of navigate through what can be potentially hostile or antagonistic. Usually, when the bullying situation happens, at least in the States, from what I've seen, more often than not, the victim of the bullying gets accused, like, oh, they need to man up, they need to figure it out, they need to toughen up, this kid is too soft. And I'm like, I don't think we're focusing on, I'm not saying the point isn't to blame, but I think that everyone needs to be involved in the conversation, and that rather than normalizing the bullying behavior and saying like that's just how people are, realizing that there's something happening there that needs to change as well, so that it's not all, again, not, the responsibility doesn't fall on the person who happens to be very sensitive or express, and I mean sensitive in a good way, like attuned
Mm.
to people, and that we are able, that they're allowed to hold on to those things, because that's, one of the fathers of the younger boys in my study said that, like, that's one of the things that's most appealing about them, that, the fact that they care about other people. And of course that, that's something that's so valuable. And so instilling in them the courage to continue caring and to express and act on that care, again, will serve them very well in their personal and professional lives. We don't want them to shut down from that. So we need to also, not just encourage them, like empower individuals, which is part of the puzzle, but also create, on a more systemic and contextual level, like situations where kids who do those things aren't at risk, because right now they are. To come back to your question, right now, unfortunately, that, they're the ones that are told, you need to figure this out, you need to toughen up. And I'm not sure that that's the right way to go about it.
Mm. I took a couple of things from that, though. Firstly, I think if it's reinforced at home that being open about your emotions and vulnerable is good and it's positive, then that should have a positive impact on the child. But also, I
Absolutely.
think even if there is some short term um, there's some bullying and some negative things short term. I think mid and long term, it will be more beneficial for the children to be like that. So it's kind of, you might have a little phase where you need to get through, but actually, as they grow into adolescence and adults, it's going to set them up a lot better than if you worry about them being vulnerable and getting bullied early. That's almost kind of kicking the can for other issues down the line.
Right. And you also teach them, and and these are things they're doing already. You kind of validate and support the fact that they are automatically going to become more savvy and strategic about how they engage. So they'll know that, oh, okay, I can't, this kid, he's always angry or she's always angry, so I don't want to be vulnerable in front of them. But there are people that are safer, or there are protective relationships, or I have really good friends who won't laugh at me when I do this, or who but you're absolutely right that you can teach them that, well, who's someone you could talk to about this. And there have been studies that show that kids, and the study I'm thinking of focused on adolescents, and they had interviewed 50,000 kids, surveyed 90,000 adolescents, and found that the single best protector against psychological risk like low self-esteem and depression, and social risk like dropping out of school, substance abuse, um, in an unintended pregnancy, was having access to at least one close confiding relationship, what's called a protective relationship. And it could be with a parent, with a friend, a sibling, a coach or teacher. But as long as they knew that there was somebody who they felt understood them and valued them and was on their side, then even when the other stuff happens, like, oh, I'm worried that if I say this or if I do this, everyone's going to make fun of me. Even when they know that that's the case in other spaces, they know they have like a protected space that they could be themselves and feel valued. And that was really, really important, and really made the difference.
What are some of the early warning signs that a boy is potentially struggling with the pressures of traditional masculinity?
I think first and foremost, there's going to be individual differences because different kids have different temperaments, and so some of them are going to be more sad, some of them are going to be more mad. It has a lot to do with kind of their personalities, and also what they've seen modeled for them, like how the adults around them or other kids around them handle feelings of frustration, for instance. But I think there's some common themes, and this was actually kind of I first became aware of these themes in Carol's work with the adolescent girls. But you'll see conflict, right? So one of the things that struggle is people are saying I'm this, but I experience myself to be these things. And so there's conflict because it's just different. And how do I reconcile that? So there's conflicts. And then there's usually a healthy resistance, which is to say a resistance against impositions, like someone else saying, no, you're actually this. And you're thinking, that's not me. And so there's a healthy resistance to impositions that kind of undermine our sense of who we are, our sense of being authentic and whole, and our integrity. And that's by that definition. And also hinder our relationships in positions that make it hard for us to connect with other people in ways that we know feel, meaningful and genuine. And so there's the conflict, a healthy resistance. And then depending on what happens, there can be compromise, like sometimes, especially for adolescents, but also for the younger kids. It's like, if it's really, really important to appear like they're fitting in, and that's becomes, really important to adolescents, especially, then they're going to say, well, I guess that's just the cost of being popular, or that's the cost of having relationships, quote unquote relationships, because then at the same time they'll say, but nobody knows who I really am, or nobody knows what I'm really like, right? And so, so you kind of ask, well, what kind of relationship is that? If people say if they're friends in name only, but nobody really, there's no one you feel like you can talk to. And so it sets up, that dilemma of having to choose between being true to yourself and being with other people is a no-win situation. But you'll see kids struggling. Like I said, there's a range. You'll see, you can see everything from sadness and being withdrawn, negative talk about themselves, especially with the younger kids, like, oh, I'm no good, nobody likes me, I'm a bad person, which is heartbreaking for a parent. Um, and then to, if they don't have language, and or they don't have opportunities to kind of process it, they can become very frustrated, they can be very impatient, and it's not always going to be in context. They might get impatient like with something that seems totally unrelated, so what we would consider kind of like acting out behaviors, like, you know I wanted a blue balloon, but I got a red balloon, and I'm so mad. Kind of, you're like, whoa, they kind of disproportionate anger kind of thing. But that's usually about something else, right? Something else is going on, and so just kind of for parents and educators to hopefully have the bandwidth and the patience to kind of sit down and say, is there something going on? Do you want to talk about it? So anything that seems like uncharacteristic behavior, like if your kid is usually, kind of easygoing and doesn't, and you see them getting really worked up about some things, then you can say, oh, what's going on with you? Do you want to talk about it? But anyway, your question was about warning signs. And so, yeah, kind of individual differences, but usually just things that you feel like are out of place. And of course, parents would need to know what is normal for their kid to notice when their kid is acting, uncharacteristically.
And then thinking again as a parent, if I want to be a bit proactive with this, what positive and potentially negative roles can parents play in shaping their son's understanding of healthy masculinity? And maybe how would a father's role potentially differ to a mother's role? Can they bring different things to the table, do you think, in that relationship?
These are great questions. Um, I think that parents, and not to put like more pressure on anybody, but you are always a role model for your kid. So everything you're doing is showing him what it is to be a man, what it is to be a father, what it is to be a person, a friend. Everything that your kids see you doing is an example for them of what is possible. And so, and that doesn't mean, parents need to be perfect all the time. In fact, I would really say they don't need perfection. Your kids, what really helps them is if you can show up as, and obviously we can't always be like self-aware and perfectly, whatever, but just to show up in the as best as we can, as honestly as we can. So you can say, I'm feeling really frustrated right now, and da 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 da, and just kind of spelling it out so they know that, okay, this happens, and it's not about them, it's about you, and you just need a moment because sometimes you're just going to feel these things, or you're disappointed, and we don't always have, again, a ready response, or we're not always we're not always able to behave in the ways we'd like to, but we're trying to, and that we can talk it out with them. Kids, I find, love stories of their parents' own struggles. I mean, it's not that they love it because they wanted their parents to struggle, but because it normalizes it for them. It's to say, like, oh, there was a time when you didn't know what to do, or you needed help, and that was hard for you. Because then they have, again, that's a model, an example for them to know that when that happens for them, it's okay. They're not the first person ever to experience that, and that they'll, get through it, and that you can come out on the other side and still be respectable and a good person and all these things. Um, so they are, especially when they're younger, they're looking up to you for everything. They're looking to you to show them how it's possible for them to be in the world. And especially for fathers, your question was about like, what is a dad's role? you know, Obviously kids need to see a whole range of people doing a whole range of behaviors, but it's also true that, social psychologists point out that when we're trying to figure out our behaviors, we look to people like me, people who look like me, people who I think are like me, or people I want to be like. And, in kids' cases, a lot of times that's going to be their parents. And also, we know that gender makes a difference. And so they're going to look to like, fathers like, oh, like, for instance, like you were saying, like dads versus moms, they might say, oh yeah, mom, she does this caring thing and it's very, wonderful. But if only mom does that, then it becomes a thing that mom and people who look like mom do. Whereas if they see you doing, caring and kindness and listening and struggling, then they're like, oh, so that's not just for girls and women or people who identify as female. That's something that, boys and men do too. And I think it's really important for them to be able to see that because it validates it when they inevitably will experience, because it's a part of being human, right? And we don't want them to have to cut off or dismiss or devalue those things in them, because it's information that their feelings and their responses to things, that's information to them that they can use to understand who they are and how they respond to things, and then make more conscientious choices about, well, did I like how I reacted to that? Or what can I do to do something different next time if I want to change it? And what have I seen other people doing? And again, even back to our example of when they're kind of caught up or focused on the be a man box, they can say, oh, well, actually, but my dad did this, or I saw my dad do this with his friends. So I know that what people are saying is the way to be a real man isn't true, or isn't the only way. And so it's really valuable for them to have all those examples.
I love that answer. There's a lot that was going through my mind as you were talking, and I just want to maybe just go back and explore some of those points a little bit. I think for me, what you were saying there was around kind of walking the walk with your kids as well. So like how you are, obviously they're going to respond to that. And also there is this perception of obviously young kids that you're invincible as parents. And I think sometimes you forget that. And as you were saying, if you show weakness, vulnerability, and showing that you don't always get it right, that will make it seem okay for them if they're going through that. And I think your other point there around men having the opportunity to show maybe more quote unquote traditional feminine qualities is a great opportunity, because then they don't always attribute that to women, as you were saying. They can attribute that to men too.
Right. There's a family therapist and couples therapist named Terry Real who talked about it in a way that I often repeat because I found it really helpful. As I say, he says, when you take the whole range of human qualities and behaviors, interests and skills, and you divide it in half, and you say this half is masculine and this half is feminine, and only boys and men can be masculine and only girls and women can be feminine, then everyone loses. Because the fact is, it's a whole range of humanity. It's the things that we need to draw. We need to draw from as fully as possible the full range in order to kind of acknowledge the things that we're experiencing and also work through those things, right? And so, you know, if we go the other way and say like, oh, only men get really angry, well, that's ridiculous because, women get angry too. But if women aren't allowed to acknowledge it, then they can't work through the anger and it just makes it that much more complicated. Same thing with men. Like if you say, oh, only women are vulnerable, again, ridiculous, because as human beings, we are physically vulnerable. We can be harmed physically, we can be harmed emotionally. And if we can't imagine, if we can't acknowledge, at least to ourselves, that reality, then we can't kind of prepare ourselves to deal with it, as effectively as possible. When we're feeling vulnerable, it doesn't help to pretend we're invincible. I mean, it might be like in a short-term thing, but in the long term, it doesn't address the things that need to be addressed in order for us to really thrive and be healthy and to move through it in the most beneficial way.
We were talking earlier around language like man up, be a man, don't cry, etc., and language that's generally best to avoid. Is there any specific language or behaviours that parents can use in a more positive way to encourage their sons to express their emotions and be a bit more open and a bit more authentic?
As with any particular phrase, I mean, we always want to do, like, let's say you hear your kids say that, man up. Or what we want to do first and foremost is check in, what does that mean to you? Because as we pointed out earlier, as you said, sometimes it means something different than what we think it means. And so if they think it means, oh, I'm just trying to encourage them to say, oh, this is hard, but you can get through it, or even what would be great in what some organizations are trying to do is like put a more positive spin on it. What does it mean to man up? And then they put the kind of the good or great man terms next to it. Like it means to show up in ways that are authentic and that are caring and trusting. And so like same thing with the idea that, sometimes the men's role as provider gets critiqued. And what Kate Mangino says in her book, Equal Partners, is instead of saying, don't be the provider, say, let's expand the role of provider. So it's not just about bringing in money and a paycheck. Provider can also be providing care and showing up in the ways that your family needs. And so same thing with the idea of, the broader idea of masculinity. Like instead of saying, don't be masculine, which whatever. I mean, masculinity and the things we associate it are not problematic in and of themselves. There's a lot of positive things that we associate with masculinity. So really, can we expand it to be more inclusive, to really address, to really represent all the things that boys and men are capable of being and the things that will serve them well? Because we don't want them to have to cut themselves off simply because that particular trait or quality is associated with, is deemed feminine, right? Because part of the whole man up directive is this idea that, well, you man up. How do you man up? You have to prove your masculinity because it can't be assumed. And how do you do that? Well, you align with these masculine traits. And importantly, in these cultures that define masculinity and femininity as opposites, you have to denounce the feminine, right? And that's where you get hurt. It's not so much that you're saying, oh, we're doing these masculine things and that's, It's because you have to give up anything that's deemed feminine, but is actually a part of, it's a human strength. It's not a feminine weakness. It's a human strength to care about people, to have empathy, to be considerate of others, to move through the world acknowledging that we need relationships because all humans do.
I want to focus my final two questions around men specifically. What steps can men take to potentially unlearn harmful ideas of masculinity and rebuild a healthier relationship with their emotions?
That is another great question. Um, I think it comes down to connection, reconnecting with themselves, and which will enable their connections or reinforce their connections to other people. So I usually say it's not a prescriptive thing. It's not like we're saying, oh, instead of this list of, just to be simplistic, like, it's not like instead of being this macho man, we want you to be this sensitive man. It's not replacing one list with another. It's not telling boys and men how they should be, but really just giving them freedom to kind of be, or to explore and discover and to be who they are without having to feel like certain things are off limits to them because it's been categorized as, feminine or masculine or unappealing or whatever. It's just allowing them to really value, what they bring uniquely and to explore it, because that's going to change too at every age and every place in any situation. you know we're constantly adapting and evolving, and so to kind of give them the freedom to figure it out instead of being told or imposed upon, like, and instructed what to do. I think that that's what leads to healthy relationships, because presence, our ability to be fully present and genuinely engaged, that impacts the quality of our relationships. That impacts how we experience our relationships, and vice versa, how we experience our relationships. If our parents, if our teachers, if our friends encourage and enable us to feel good about themselves and to be honest, then that also impacts, how we view ourselves and how we bring ourselves to other relationships. And so I usually say, presence depends on relationships and vice versa. Relationships depend on presence. And so what's at the core of that is, again, just kind of self-reflection, critical reflection about what we're being told, feeling supported and encouraged to kind of consider, is this right for me? I mean, one of the little boys in my study, in the early childhood study, said that his parents told him, if you don't like it, then don't do it. And it seems really simple, and it seems like you wouldn't need to tell somebody that. But sometimes, especially for young people, then they're just trying to fit in, and they just want to be liked and included. Sometimes that doesn't seem like an option. Like, it can feel like, oh, well, my parents told me I have to do this, in order to be, or my friends said I have to do it, or they don't want to be friends with me. But to really give kids language and permission to trust their instincts and to kind of honor what they know and what they bring. I think too often we downplay how much kids know. That, I guess, that comes back to your question about, what surprised me was how much they have opinions. Of course, having kids, you learn very quickly after the age of 2 or 3. Yes, they have opinions and they have preferences, but to see that as like, not like, oh, that's like, sometimes people will walk into a restaurant and they'll see like two adults and the kid, and they'll be like, oh, 2.5 people. I'm like, actually, that's a full person. That's not a half person. And kids, from the moment they're born, they bring their personality, as even as babies, they'll let what they like. And so to really allow kids to at least have that fundamental respect for themselves, which will become a seed for respecting other people. And similarly, empathy, compassion for themselves will become, will facilitate their compassion and empathy for other people. And so it's really, really like interconnected. But this idea of, the unlearning, I usually say it's not about teaching them something new or asking them to become more like girls and women or to become something else, but just helping them to, for younger boys, stay with, and for older boys, return to what they know. They have an inherent capacity and desire that's evident in as early as 3 months old, and infant studies have shown an inherent capacity and desire to develop and engage in close, mutual, responsive relationships. And so just to return to that, they have the skills, they have the capability for it. And what gets in the way are these socialization messages that say, oh no, that's for girls. Emotions and relationships. And that's, think about like what that includes. When we say emotions and relationships are for girls and women, what does that, take away from boys and men and non-binary folks and everyone else who obviously needs and has emotions and relationships as well? So again, kind of preventing those the unnecessary struggling by honoring, valuing all these things that are human qualities in all humans.
And then how can friends and partners help with this as well? How can they create a safe space that encourages men to open up about their struggles without feeling judged?
That's I think there's a lot. I think to offer a kind of possibly overly simplistic thing is, and it also takes a lot of courage, is they need to show up in the ways that they want to allow people to show up. And so if you're feeling brave, and I hope more individuals can feel that way, check in with your friends when you notice, because they do notice, because, again, the stereotype says boys and men are oblivious. They're not. They notice it, but sometimes out of respect, they're like, "Oh, I don't want him to know that I see how he's struggling." But really, give yourself permission to check in and to be a good friend and to say, "Hey, what's going on? Do you want to talk?" And if they don't want to, that's fine, but at least they know somebody cares, and that can also be very helpful. And then showing up, like, if you say you're going to listen and you're going to be available, then show up and that kind of be present in the moment. Just listen. You don't, and people say, oh, I don't want to ask because I don't know what to do. I'm not a professional therapist. I don't have counseling skills. But really, usually when people are struggling, they don't want someone to offer them solutions, like to say like, oh yeah, you just fix it, just do this. I mean, in fact, it can feel insulting, at least in my experience. Like if I'm struggling with someone and someone has like a 2 minute, 2 second answer to like, oh, well, all you need to do is just do this. But usually we just want someone to listen. So I usually say, start with listening, check in, start with listening. One of the 12-year-old boys that I interviewed when I was looking at adolescence said, just that feeling that someone else knows what you're going through and understands, he said, it kind of comforts. And so that was, that's all we really want. So we don't need you to have professional level advice. And if something is more serious, then yeah, as a friend, help them get the help they need. Um, if you can't provide it. But I think those initial steps anyone can do is, checking in, showing up, and sometimes going first. Like, in the beginning, like, oh, this has been hard, or the pandemic has been hard, or it sucked to not be able to hang out with people. But also not when they start to share, not being like, oh, well, let me tell you about my thing, because then that becomes about you. So, if they're reluctant to share, then maybe you can offer a nugget or two. But once they start sharing, be careful not to kind of take over and be like, oh yeah, I totally understand because I went through it too. Because you don't want to make it about, we don't want to make it about us, and until it's our turn, until it's our turn, or if they ask us, have you ever gone through that, and things like that. So. I remember watching this one panel of young men, and they said, "We know relationships are important. We know we're supposed to talk about our problems." And this kid said, "Well, it's not kid. He was maybe 17 years old. He says, I literally don't know how to do it. I've never seen it done." And so, things that we kind of take for granted, people should just know how to do. We sometimes just need to say, oh, well, like tips and tricks, like, oh, this is one way to do it. These are, you don't have to say exactly these words, but here's what it looks like. And again, this is where the role modeling can happen when they see men in different things. And it doesn't always have to be like an emotional problem that the men are talking about, like, oh, I can't figure this out. What can I do about it? Who can I ask? How can I do? Just to see examples of how it can be done and ways to do it can be very helpful and give them what they need when it comes time for them to ask for help or to offer it.
Dr. Judy, thank you for your time. This conversation really has felt like a breath of fresh air, and it's almost felt like a bit of a weight's been lifted. I mean, I was saying at the top of the show, I do feel a pressure of bringing up a boy with everything that's going on in today's society. And I think what you've shed a light on for me is we need to give the kids more credit. Like they're more socially aware than we give them credit for. And yes, we play a big role in how they grow up and how they develop, but actually they've got the tools themselves to turn out pretty much okay. We just need to facilitate that. So I think that's been very enlightening for me, and I'm sure a lot of people listening will feel the same. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, you're so welcome.